In today's video, we're taking a deep dive into life in the American colonies by the mid 1700s, an era rich with diversity, transformation, and a growing sense of identity. We'll explore the pluralistic society that emerged, the religious revival known as the First Great Awakening, the intellectual upheaval of the Enlightenment, and how both English influence and uniquely American values were shaping the colonies in different and sometimes contradictory ways. Let's get started. By the middle of the 18th century, what had started as a collection of struggling English villages had grown into a vibrant society of around 1.5 million people. But this new colonial culture was not a replica of England. It was distinct, forged by a wide range of peoples, beliefs, and experiences. What set the American colonies apart was their pluralism, a blend of races, religions, ethnicities, and ideas. By 1754, the British colonies were home to not just English settlers, but also Native Americans, forcibly imported Africans, especially in the South, and large groups of Dutch in New York, Germans in Pennsylvania, often called the Pennsylvania Dutch, and Scots Irish, who typically settled along the western frontier. While few immigrants ventured to Puritan dominated New England, where land was scarce and society was rigid, many were drawn to the middle and southern colonies by the promise of economic opportunity and self determination, things not as easily attained in Europe. The colonies offered religious toleration to varying degrees and lacked the rigid hereditary aristocracies that dominated European life. This allowed for greater social mobility, at least for some. But it's crucial to remember that not all came seeking freedom. The largest single group arriving in the colonies were enslaved Africans, brought against their will across the Atlantic. By 1775, African Americans accounted for 20% of the colonial population. As colonial populations pushed westward, they came into increasing conflict with Native American tribes. Confederations such as the Iroquois and the Powhatan formed alliances to protect their lands from encroachment, further complicating the colonial landscape. As the colonies diversified, many regions, particularly the frontier, saw a decline in traditional church membership. But beginning in the 1730s, a sweeping religious revival known as the First Great Awakening began to change that. This revival brought emotional, passionate religious expression to the forefront. Preachers traveled widely, drawing massive crowds in tents, barns, and open fields. One of the leading voices was Jonathan Edwards, whose sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, warned of divine wrath and emphasized the need for heartfelt repentance. Another major figure, George Whitefield, became a transcolonial sensation, preaching to crowds of 10,000 or more. The Great Awakening didn't just emphasize faith, it disrupted the traditional power structure of religion. A split formed between the New Lights, who embraced the emotional revivalism, and the Old Lights, who preferred traditional intellectual forms of worship. New Protestant denominations rose, challenging the dominance of the Anglicans and the Congregationalists. As more people began reading the Bible themselves, ministers lost some of their control over religious life. Perhaps most importantly, the First Great Awakening was a shared experience across the 13 colonies. It encouraged a sense of equality between clergy and lay people and contributed to the idea that individuals had both the right and the ability to challenge authority, an idea that would echo into the coming revolution. While the Great Awakening reshaped the spiritual life of the colonies, another movement, the Enlightenment, was reshaping its intellectual life. Originating in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment emphasized reason, science, and individualism over religious dogma. Enlightenment thinkers believed that human beings could use logic to improve society. These ideas crossed the Atlantic through books and the transatlantic trade, taking root among educated colonists. Perhaps the most influential Enlightenment thinker in America was John Locke, who argued that all individuals possess natural rights and that government exists to protect those rights. If a government failed to do this, Locke believed the people not only had the right, but the obligation to overthrow it. These radical ideas would become the intellectual foundation of the American Revolution. The Enlightenment also sparked a surge in education, curiosity about government, and debate over colonial rights and liberties. Despite their diversity, the colonies were also experiencing a process called Anglicization, the tendency to adopt British customs and structures. Religiously, the Church of England retained strong influence, especially in the South. Economically, the colonies were deeply integrated into British trade networks through the system of mercantilism. Colonists consumed British goods, they wore British fashions, and depended on British markets for selling raw materials. Politically, many colonial governments were based on English models of governance, including local legislatures and common law traditions. But as the colonies took on English traits, they were also evolving their own distinct American identity. They had a long tradition of self government, shaped by the freedom to make decisions far from the direct control of London. They were also far more ethnically and religiously diverse than England, and had become accustomed to salutary neglect, Britain's unofficial policy of leaving the colonies to govern themselves so long as trade flowed. When Britain began enforcing trade rules like the Navigation Acts, colonists grew suspicious and resentful. A tension was building, one between the familiarity of English influence and the pride of emerging independence. By the mid 1700s, the American colonies were a society unlike any other, shaped by pluralism, awakened by revivalism, inspired by rationalism, and torn between British identity and American self determination. The people of the colonies were laying the groundwork for revolution. Their shared experiences, whether spiritual revivals in the countryside or philosophical debates in taverns, fostered a belief in equality, liberty, and the right to question authority. These ideas would soon erupt into action. But that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.